Good evening and welcome to Parashat Vayishlach. Baruch Hashem, we'll be back in Shul this week, but I just wanted to share with you a beautiful message before Shabbat. Everybody knows that if you have a test that's coming up, invariably there's going to be something called stress beforehand. Imagine for a minute you were preparing to go into battle, you were preparing to fight a war. There's definitely going to be major stress. Yaakov in this week's parsha hears about his brother Esav, who's charging towards him, not for a casual meeting, but with 400 trained warriors. And at this point, he has no idea. Does Esav hate him, like him? What are his intentions? Is he still angry about the fact that he took his blessings from his father? Or maybe 30 years of separation has calmed him down. So he acts with speed. He divides up his camp into two. He sends gifts on ahead. He begins to pray. And the night before the big encounter, the Torah tells us, Vayakom balayla, who he gets up at that night, Vayikach et shenashav et shet, he takes all his family and his 12 children, Vayavor et me'ever yabok, and they cross the river. And he Vayikachem vayiverem et hanacha vayiver deshlo, he takes everything with him. It seems that his entire family and everything that he owns is with him at this point in time. But in the very next verse, we're told, Vayivater Yaakov levado, Yaakov suddenly remains alone. The Torah places him back by himself on the other side of the river. And the question is obvious. If Yaakov has already crossed with all his family, how does he end up on the other side of the river? The Talmud raises this question. And the Talmud answers, Shachach pakim ketanim v'chazar alehem. He returns to the camp because he forgot pakim ketanim, small, insignificant jugs of pottery and earthenware. And the logic is thus. If the verse has told us that Yaakov crossed with all his possessions, and then it tells us that Yaakov is alone, whatever he returned for must have been completely insignificant and not really considered a valid possession. If that's the case, Mordechai Kamenetsky asks a mind-blowing question. Why does Yaakov go back to retrieve something so insignificant as an earthenware jar on the very night before he was preparing for the most difficult encounter of his life? What is the lesson here? There's a beautiful story that is told in the summer of 1954. Ita Kamenetsky, the wife of the great Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, was leaving the Beth Israel hospital for the very last time after a prolonged stay. Her condition had deteriorated to such a point that the doctors felt there wasn't much else they could do to help her. And the great Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky went together with his family to pick her up. She was wheeled out of the hospital and she was about to be placed into an accompanying car when Rav Yaakov stopped, turned to the driver and says, "Do you mind waiting for a moment?" He whispered something to his wife and his wife nodded. He wasn't quite sure what was going on. His son accompanies him back into the hospital thinking, "We took everything out of her room. What are you worried about, Abba?" The father didn't answer. He took the floor up to the third floor, whatever it is. They walked out and went back into the room where his wife had been just a few moments before. And in that room was his wife's former roommate, so to speak, who turned out to be someone who was very, very sick. And Rav Yaakov turns to her and says, "In our rush to leave the hospital, I forgot to say goodbye and to wish you well. May God give you a speedy recovery." And with that, he walked out of the room at the stunned look of all these nurses and doctors who he'd already said goodbye to a few minutes before. And he left for the waiting car. Yaakov went back for something that in our estimation maybe would have been insignificant, maybe petty, maybe a bit frivolous. But he knew otherwise. That small little jar may have been something of tremendous sentimental value to one of his family members. An old blanket, an old doll, may have meant something very special to one of his children. Yaakov, our forefather, taught us that everything in life has value. Everything in life has something special associated with it. It's very easy to say, as Mordechai Kamenetsky said, "I've crossed the river, I've already packed, I've already left the building." Yaakov's lesson is telling us that even if there is a risk, the little things in life are just as important as the big things in life. And to quote Rav Mordechai Kamenetsky's words, because he says this best, "Some acts are glorified, others are seemingly insignificant and petty. We can never judge which investments yield great returns. and which returns are great investments. Shabbat Shalom.